Hello, everybody. Great to be back once again. Today, I am happy to announce that we are going right back into the Fallout franchise, as you guys really seem to enjoy my last video on Vault 11. If you haven't checked that one, don't worry, you won't need to have watched it to understand what we're going to be talking about today, but it might give you a little bit of a better understanding of the setting as a whole. Now, today, we are not talking about any of the other vaults. Instead, we are talking about the tragic events that happen to a person that undergoes too much radiation exposure in the Fallout universe, and that is ghoulification. Now, what exactly is ghoulification? As I said, is what happens to a person if they undergo too much exposure to radiation. Now, this process can take anywhere from just a few hours to an entire year, as it depends on the level of exposure that you get. Now, what happens when you become a ghoul, when you undergo ghoulification, is that your skin starts to thin and then peel off. Your nose falls off, and so do your ears. Your hair also eventually falls out. You undergo a state of living necrosis as the radiation tears apart your body, but also keeps you from fully dying. When the ghoulification process is fully completed, you barely represent what looks like a normal person anymore. Sure, you have your arms and your legs, hopefully, and you can still speak as well, hopefully, but as I've stated, your skin has exposed muscles all throughout it. You have little to no hair. You have lost your sense of smell as your nose has fully fallen off, and your hearing has also most likely been damaged, as well as your vocal cords, as you now have this deep, guttural, raspy voice that makes you sound more like something out of the living dead than an actual full-blown human being. Now, it's not technically all hardship, as becoming a ghoul does come with a few benefits. For example, due to the radiation ripping its way through your body and making your overall body functions a bit slower than normal, the amount of drugs or alcohol it takes for somebody to feel anything is doubled the required amount than it would for a normal person. And as I've also stated, depending on the amount of radiation you suffered, the physical effects may be a bit easier to look at, as people who are closer to ground zero of, say, a nuclear explosion, for example, may completely look like shambling corpses, whereas someone maybe a bit further away or who was exposed to radiation throughout a longer period of time to become a ghoul may look a bit more decent on the eyes. They'll still have horribly scarred skin, probably no hair. If they do, maybe a very little amount of it, and they still, like I said, won't exactly be a pretty picture, but it's a lot better than the alternative. Now, with such a horrible process, surely no one has ever gone through this willingly. However, there actually have been two that we know of. That a person named Desmond, who was a former British intelligence officer for the British Army, and Eddie, who was a mob boss before the Great War. Now, you may be asking, how are these people ghouls if they existed before the Great War? How did they become ghouls before the Great War? Well, you see, since Desmond was such a high level of an espionage agent, and since Eddie was a mobster who bribed a government official, they knew the Great War was happening. They knew it was going to happen, so they underwent the process of ghoulification to prepare themselves for the war. And now you also may be wondering, how are they possibly still alive after nearly 200 years at least from the Great War happening? Well, another benefit of ghoulification, if you can call it that, is that you are functionally immortal. That's right. You no longer have to worry about old age. Now, ghouls can, of course, still die to, say, an explosion or to gunfire or to a strong melee weapon, but as it for old age, you don't really have to worry about that anymore. Another benefit of this process, as I said, with their stomachs being tougher, their digestive tracts being tougher, and them also no longer having a sense of smell anymore, they can actually stomach some pretty horrendous food. And because of their hearty stomachs, they can actually basically eat almost anything and have it be sustainable for them. That is, if they ever really even need to eat in the first place, as it's honestly debated whether or not they actually need to or not. We have a case in the game Fallout 4 with the tragic kid Billy, who will get his own video, trust me, because his story is horribly tragic. But Billy was stuck for 200 years, isolated, with no access to food or water. And when we find him in the game, he's fine. He doesn't seem starving, he doesn't seem overly thirsty, he doesn't seem on the brink of death even. He seems completely fine. Yet we do see other ghouls in the game saying, "Oh, I'm going to get something to eat," or we see them resting and eating or drinking. So we don't really know if they just do this out of habit or because they enjoy it, or if maybe some ghouls, depending on radiation exposure, do still need to eat and drink. We're not sure, unfortunately. Now, you may be hearing these benefits, and it might say, "Oh, maybe being a ghoul isn't quite so bad. Sure, I look not that great. I don't have a sense of smell anymore. And I obviously had to go through some pretty traumatic radiation exposure to become this. But maybe the benefits are outweighing the negatives." However, this part might cause you to rethink that, as when you go under the process of becoming a ghoul, you actually have the possibility of going feral. Now, feral ghouls are more traditionally what you might associate with a zombie. They are cannibalistic, as they eat people. They are complete monsters who will attack any person on sight and can't be reasoned with. They can't talk anymore, seemingly, and are just complete and total monsters that have been the bane and death of many, many survivors throughout the wastelands. And the horrible part about this is that we actually don't know what the difference is between someone becoming a feral ghoul and a non-feral one. We thought it was maybe levels of exposure to radiation, but people have been close to ground zeros of nuclear blasts, and some of them turned out fine. We also thought for a while that maybe it was isolation, people who were ghouls by themselves for too long eventually just snap and turn feral. But as we talked about with Billy, he was alone completely and totally for 200 years, all by himself in a cramped space with no one to talk to. And when we find him, he's fully sentient and aware of himself and his surroundings. And we also hear tales of ghouls who were part of societies or groups suddenly just turning feral one day. So, horrifically enough, it might actually be completely and totally random. It seems that sometimes ghouls can just become a ghoul and become feral instantly, or it could happen days, weeks, months, or even years after they become a ghoul. Finally, their brain just eventually snaps one day, and then it's over. There's no cure for feral ghouls, unfortunately. Once they're gone, they're seemingly gone forever. Now, one last detail I want to talk about is the glowing ones. Now, glowing ghouls can happen to both feral and sentient ghouls. However, glowing ones that are still sentient don't really have an opportunity to become part of any group or such. Glowing ghouls emit radiation just by simply standing around them. This happens because their body has stopped filtering out the radiation that is in their bodies, and because of that, it is physically building up in their body, and which is causing them to glow like this and passively just emit radiation. Ghouls also, unfortunately, can face a lot of discrimination as people don't trust them, as they could become feral, or they just simply don't like looking at them, or just obviously because of their appearances. But it isn't the case everywhere, as there are societies that do still welcome ghouls with open arms and don't care. And even for ghouls that can't find such societies, there are societies completely made up of ghouls for them to seek sanctuary in. Perhaps the ghouls will be the last one left. Immortal, no food, no water, or at the very least, very little of it is needed. While the wastelanders succumb to radiation, sickness, old age, starvation, thirst, they will simply live on forever. Now, another aspect of the ghoulification is that they are incredibly resilient. If they lose a limb, they can simply reattach it and it will eventually graft back onto their bodies. And this process can actually be sped up if they are exposed to more radiation, as not only does radiation help heal them, it also makes their abilities stronger. The more radiation a ghoul is exposed to, the actually stronger they become. But that's all we know on ghouls. Now, there are some other specific kinds of ghouls or one-off appearances of like some weird kinds, but I kind of want to give those characters their own videos as they have quite the extensive stories of their own, and I don't want to take up too much of your time here. Do you think becoming a ghoul in this world would be worth it? Do you think having the appearance, the no sense of smell, or the process, or the possibility of possibly going feral is worth it in a world such as Fallout? Does the extra resilience and lack of aging and to be able to eat basically whatever you need at any given time, is it worth it for the discrimination, for the, again, way you look, the lack of smell? That's the main question I want to ask, as it is a question that has gone through the community for quite a long time. Would the time that you spent being alive and the things you've seen simply drive you mad? Would you happen to just go feral? Is it worth it if you didn't? Let me know down in the comment section down below. I want to know what you guys all think of this. But until next time. Hello, class. Welcome back. Sorry this lecture took so long to come out. I recorded this whole thing, was ready for it to go out into editing process, and then it got deleted by mistake. So, sorry about that delay. But without further ado, let's get into today's topic. Now, today we are discussing some of the updated ghoul lore that we got in the Fallout TV show. Now, I know I am slightly late to this party, but I figured it would be a great update for our previous lecture on ghouls in the Fallout franchise. If you hadn't seen that lecture yet, I highly recommend doing so, as you'll get much more context for what we're talking about here. So, one of the big main questions in that ghoul lore lecture was the difference between feral and non-feral ghouls. Now, we know that ghouls could become feral, becoming basically no more than zombies, or they could be non-feral, completely sentient and normal like you and me, but obviously with the necrotic skin, lack of smell, etc., etc. So, we had no idea what caused this difference, whether it was isolation, radiation exposure, etc., etc. But the Fallout show finally gave us an answer. And it is revealed that a drug that the ghouls can take via an inhaler is what keeps them from going feral. It keeps them sane. It lets them hold on to their humanity while having both the benefits and drawbacks of being a ghoul. Now, we can see this with the main ghoul character, we can see this with his friend that eventually succumbs to being a feral ghoul, and we can also see it tragically with some other ghoul characters that the main character rescues. Now, personally, I really like this as it answers a long question that we have all had on how ghouls can either be feral or non feral, because for the longest time, ever since the introduction of the series, we've gotten nothing. As I said in a previous lecture, there was always theories, but no concrete definitive answer. However, now some people I've noticed do have a problem with this, as is obviously never mentioned in any of the games. We never see a ghoul in an idle animation taking an inhaler or mentioning an inhaler that keeps them sane or anything like that. But personally, I don't mind it all that much, and I think it's a great addition to the lore that answers a long old question that beforehand kind of was just never addressed or talked about or mentioned or even really brought up. To my knowledge, there isn't even any dialogue options in any of the games where your character can ask, hey, what's the difference? Or how does this happen? Or anything like that. So it's just kind of a nice little addition for me personally that I very much enjoy. But back into how it works. So, as we can see, ghouls can purchase these drugs, for lack of a better term, and they put them into an inhaler, and they take the inhaler ever so often in order to keep themselves sane and non feral. We can actually see in the show what it's like when a ghoul starts to go feral. At first, they seem to just kind of get physically weaker, a bit more tired more easily. Then they start coughing and they have trouble staying awake. Eventually, it can lead to things such as fainting, blacking out, etc., as we see with the main ghoul character in the show. Once he goes long enough without having his drugs, he full on faints onto the floor and can hardly even move. Beyond that, we can see that you kind of start to lose your sanity. You repeat simplistic phrases, you have these twitches, you start groaning or grunting or screaming, and it seems like it is a very painful process, and it also seems to cause a great deal of mental strain and anguish as you can feel your sanity leaving you. It's very grim and very dark, and I kind of like that the Fallout show wasn't afraid to show us that darker side of what it could fully mean to go feral. And then we see the last stage, which is full feral. Little more than a zombie. Now, we don't know if a feral ghoul could be cured. We don't know if a feral ghoul, if given this drug, would regain their sanity, or if maybe they need a higher dose for it to regain it. We simply don't know, as no one in the show, as of yet, only season 1 is out at the time of recording this, we don't know, because we never see a character in the show give an inhaler to a feral ghoul. We can assume that it most likely wouldn't work, or even if it did, the danger of doing so simply isn't really worth trying, perhaps. We again just simply don't know, but in my opinion, I would assume that it wouldn't work. Now, there is another aspect to this drug, in that it seems that if a non-ghoul person takes the drug, it ghoulifies them. We can actually see this in the show with the character of Thaddeus, who is the apprentice who is the squire to Maximus, and then later goes out on his own, so on and so forth. He had taken a horrible injury to his foot and then runs into a snake oil salesman who gives him a drug that will supposedly heal him. And to our surprise and shock, it does almost instantaneously. And I don't mean a foot injury as in a light sprain or even a break. Parts of his flesh were gone. His toe was hanging off, and it just simply regenerated in a matter of seconds. Now, later in the show, we see him also take an arrow through the neck and it quickly heals, showing that he has in fact become a ghoul. Now, he's not really decayed or missing hair or anything like that, so we don't know if perhaps maybe the drug only sort of lightly turns you into a ghoul and saves you some of the more horrendous side effects, such as losing your hair, losing your sense of smell, the skin decay, etc., etc. Or maybe if he's just only in the early processes of being a ghoul still and hasn't fully had some of the more horrific side effects happen to him as of yet, and that's just further down the line. Again, we don't exactly know. And we can assume that the sort of healing drug that he took is the same drug that ghouls take when they need to avoid going feral. We don't know for sure if it was the same drug, but we can assume that it was. Now, one little thing that this lore change does kind of hinder in my personal opinion, is while I think it is a good welcome addition to the lore, and while I do think it is a good explanation for the lore, it does raise a couple of questions. The main question being is actually a subject that we talked about in our previous lecture on ghouls, and that being of Billy, the kid ghoul that you can find in Fallout 4. He was isolated inside of a private little shelter for hundreds of years, slowly turning into a ghoul. However, when we find him, despite hundreds of years of isolation and therefore hundreds of years of not taking the drug, he's completely sane, completely non-feral, and completely fine. And this raises a major question. How? So, there are a few theories that I can come up with and that I've kind of seen some people in the fandom come up with. Perhaps it's simply due to his age. Maybe if you become a ghoul when you're younger, you can hold on to your sanity and you can avoid needing the drug altogether. Perhaps it's still a level of radiation exposure. Maybe only if you're very highly irradiated, you need to take the drug in order to avoid going insane. But if you only become a ghoul slowly through casual radiation or less high doses of radiation, maybe you don't need the drug. Maybe your body can sort of still naturally fight it off on its own. Again, we unfortunately don't really know. Perhaps this just makes this quest entirely, completely uncanon now. Maybe it's completely retconned or something. We'll maybe find out in season 2 of the show. Perhaps they'll reveal something that explains this. But that is all the updated ghoul lore that we have for now. If season 2 ever updates any knowledge about ghouls for us, or perhaps if another game updates our knowledge of ghouls, I'll be sure to make another follow-up video to let you all know. But until next time. Hello again, class. Today we are taking a look at something that happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I am, of course, talking about Star Wars. Now, given how long and expansive Star Wars has been around for, there's bound to be some creepy stories lurking in the vast lore of this universe. And that is what we are discussing today. For today, We are discussing the Blackwing virus, otherwise known by its official name in the Imperial circles as Imperial Bioweapon Project 17A. Now, the Blackwing virus is truly something horrifying to behold, as seen in the book Death Troopers, which if you haven't read, do so. It is fantastic. There's physical copies, ebooks, audiobooks out there. I'm sure you can find it. And just know that I will be getting into some minor spoilers, technically. Not so much about the plot of the book itself, but just simply the fact that the Blackwing virus is in fact in this book. So just know that. But don't worry, I won't be going over the plot or anything. That's for another video. Regardless, the Blackwing virus itself is originally made with Sith alchemy, and it was activated by a strange orchid flower that was not only force sensitive of all things, but actually completely self-aware, like you or me. Unlike most plants that follow the basic definition of a living object, this one seemed to have complete and total consciousness. The virus itself was created by Darth Dreer 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, basically 4,000 years before the events of Episode 2. And also, because it is activated by this flower that is supposedly self-aware, it is heavily considered that the virus itself is also self-aware and actively wants itself to be spread as much as possible. Now, this virus wasn't exactly created to be that, a virus. In fact, it wasn't even really necessarily meant to be created as a weapon. Originally, the Sith wanted to create it as something that all Sith want: immortality. It wasn't meant to turn you into a shabbling corpse of the undead, but rather to make you live forever. However, this project failed and turned Darth Dreer into nothing more but a walking corpse. Now, thankfully, it didn't spread at all during this time, and it just completely stayed self-contained in said Sith. However, 1,000 years later, another Sith sought to succeed where Darth Dreer had failed, and his name was Darth Scabrous. He tried to recreate the virus, thinking surely he had just been a fool in the past, and that he could create it. However, he also failed. But not only did it infect himself, but also every single Sith teacher and student that was in the academy he was studying in. And every single one of them was transformed into a shambling corpse of the undead. Now, thankfully, this stayed entirely self-contained on this planet, as we don't really hear anything else of this spreading any further than this planet, heavily implying that, kind of similar to perhaps 28 days later, eventually the infected do expire if lack of food or other self-sustaining resources are unavailable. However, this is not where the story of the virus ends. After another 3,000 years, Vader himself commissions a science team of the Empire to re-engineer the virus, this time as a weapon. Now, the side effects of the virus itself, before you turn that is, cause severe pain and hallucinations, and eventually leads to internal hemorrhaging in seizures, which kills you and then revives you as an undead monster. Now, How long it takes for the virus to turn somebody can slightly vary depending on the strain and how you're infected. A bite will turn you within seconds to at most a few minutes, whereas things such as bodily fluids, such as getting infected blood in your mouth, nose, eyes, ears, etc., to also an airborne strain of the virus, because yes, there is a separate strain that is airborne, will sometimes buy you a bit more time and take longer, but it is still an inevitability that you will turn. It will just take slightly longer to do so. Eventually, the team that Vader assigned was able to completely and totally recreate the virus. But just before it could be deployed, an accident happened. And the virus that the Star Destroyer was stored on was released, infecting many of the crew almost instantly, and the rest being hunted down by the shambling corpses, leaving only a few survivors. Now, a few of you may be wondering, is there a cure? Is there any way to prevent this? Is there any escape from it? Well, there are a few ways. Antiviral injections, for example, have a possible chance of giving you minor immunity to the virus. However, it is not guaranteed, and it seems to only work some of the time and not always. And of course, probably direct bites may not be able to be shielded against no matter how many antiviral injections you have, but could perhaps protect you against the airborne strain or things like infected bodily fluids. And there have been cases of people being immune to the airborne strain. It is rare, but there are people who are immune to the airborne strain. However, they are still susceptible to the strain that is transmitted through bites. Some last notes on the virus here, to truly tingle your spine about this monstrosity of a virus before I leave you, class, is that the virus can learn from its hosts. Sure, the infected start off as basically mindless, shambling corpses, basically something you would see out of the Walking Dead franchise. However, the longer the infected stay alive, the more they seem to be able to draw out the memories of the person they infected. If that person knew how to wield a blaster, the infected now does. If they knew how to wield a lightsaber, the infected now does. If they knew how to fly a ship, the infected now does. Not only that, but they can also eventually learn to avoid danger. They can hide in the shadows. They can lure you into traps. And not only that, but the virus itself has a hive mind, meaning that if one spots you, any and all infected in the area know where you are. It's either all or nothing with these. You are either completely unspotted, completely hidden, or all of them know where you are. And that ability to learn is frightening. Sure, at first they start off as a shambling corpse, but then eventually you might have a zombie that knows how to use a blaster and fires at you. Now you have to worry about that. You have to worry about one learning how to pilot a ship from its host and possibly flying away to spread it to a nearby planet or another nearby ship or an incalculable number of other things. It is truly a virus that is horrifying to behold. And frankly, even for the Sith, even for the Empire, it genuinely should just be left alone. But that is all we have time for today. What did you think of the Blackwing virus? Have you read the Death Troopers book? If you have, let me know what you think of it. Personally, I'm a pretty big fan. But until next time.
Hello, class. Today we're diving into some more folklore because I just can't simply get enough of it. Today we are going back to the lands of Scandinavia, specifically to the land of Norway. So, get comfy, get cozy, gather around the fire, and today we will be talking about the horrific tale of Draugen. Now, you may be confused by that name and think, aren't I speaking of perhaps the Draugr, the sort of Norse mythology zombies that are often made as enemies in various Nordic related games like Skyrim and the new Norse mythology based God of War games, of course. And while this creature is somewhat similar, he is a different beast altogether. You see, just like you and I, Draugen started as a regular person, a sailor, in fact, sailing out to sea, most likely as part of his profession, though the specific reasons are quite lost to time. We aren't sure if perhaps he was a Viking of old, or a trader of some sort, or perhaps he just simply liked to sail. We aren't quite sure. However, what is known for sure is that one day, while out at sea, he faced a rather grim fate. He was dragged down to the depths in a mighty storm, his boat torn asunder, and his body forced down into the bottom of the sea, where he eventually drowned and perished. Now, similarly to the Draugr, his fate did not end here, for it is said that he is now a creature of hulking size, covered in seaweed, smelling and reeking of decayed flesh and corpses, with a look that is quite similar to that of a Draugr who has perhaps been drowned at sea for many a millennia. Now, you might be wondering what such a horrifying creature does. Well, I suppose that you can probably think of what such a horrifying creature would do, given his origin story. It's said that when he comes to your ship, most likely during a fierce, dark storm across the sea, that you will hear the distant rowing of oars, a reeking smell of an unholy combination of the Atlantic Ocean and death itself. And then you will hear a horrendous, blood-curdling scream as a massive figure rises up out of the ocean itself and comes to claim your vessel as well as your life as it drags you down to the bottom of the sea, never to be seen again. And it is said that the last thing that anyone would hear of you is only your own horrified scream. Now, we do actually have a quite interesting tale of a survivor of Draugen. It was said that this tale actually took place on land, hinting that perhaps even on coastal towns that are beheld by storms aren't safe from him. For it is said that this man witnessed Draugen rise up out of the sea, and he ran into a nearby church, and as he did, he begged and he pleaded the spirits of the dead there buried at that church to please aid him to save his life from Draugen. He stayed in that church that entire night, and when he went back out the next day, all the caskets had been opened, and seaweed covered the entirety of the grounds of the church. Now, as to why this specifically happened to this particular sailor, we don't know. And by the particular sailor, I mean Draugen himself. Obviously, unfortunately, many people throughout history have been lost to sea, drowned, or had their ships torn asunder, or attacked by predators. A great many things have happened, but it is quite interesting that only this specifically happened to himself. Perhaps he has a similar case to the Draugen, where he was a particularly greedy man in his life, and specifically since he was lost to sea itself, that it had a play in him coming back as such a water-based horrific creature. Perhaps he did something to anger the Norse god Njord himself, the god of the sea, and that specifically brought on this grim fate to him. Perhaps